How exactly do you recruit well after being way under 500 in college football? We'll answer that question today. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pac-12, your daily podcast on the Pac-12 Conference. It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Locked On Pac-12. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin, D1 play-by-play broadcaster. Thanks for making this your first listen or your first view if you're watching on YouTube every day, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. This is your number one source to stay up to date with the Conference of Champions every weekday and to stay in tune with the latest around the conference when it comes to recruiting. We bring on John Garcia Jr., the Director of Recruiting for Sports Illustrated, back on the pod. Let's hop right into it because I have a question that is just burning at the top of my mind. Arizona goes 1-11 in 2021. Stanford goes 3-9 in 2021. For those of us math majors at home, I'm not one of them, but maybe there are a couple of you out there, that computes to a 4-20 combined record. And yet, when you look at the top recruiting classes in 2022 in the Pac-12 Conference, Arizona and Stanford find themselves very close to the top on a high school only basis without factoring in the transfer portal. Before Oregon got a couple of late commitments from guys like Josh Connerly, who we might talk about a little bit later as well today in the show, Arizona was second, and they were in a top 25 level, and Stanford was the top recruiting class. How does that happen? How do you go from an utter lack of on-field results to going out and selling your program in a significant way, keeping kids committed who made verbal commitments in the past? I mean, how does that happen, John?
This is a great question, Spencer, because these two in particular are great case studies, and they're on opposite ends of the spectrum. So I think we'll start with Stanford because it's just simpler to explain. Look, David Shaw still gets the benefit of the doubt from basically everyone in high school and college football because there is kind of this longstanding belief that when he gets it right, it's really right at Stanford. And obviously the academics sell themselves at a program like that. So there is a belief that, hey, 3-9 is more of an anomaly than something we're going to see on a consistent basis. The Pac-12 is in flux. It will bounce back over there. So naturally, you're going to get an influx of recruits. But I do think that they hit kind of some conventional Stanford marks in this class. One, obviously, you recruit nationally, right? Stanford is one of those programs that, despite being in a great recruiting foundation in California and the Bay Area, you've got to recruit nationally because of the academics. And I think 14 states were represented in this class of 2022. But in the state, you did win some key battles, and that starts with David Bailey, the SI-99 pass rusher from modern day. Heavyweight battle for him. A lot of people thought this was USC's race to lose, and maybe it was at one point. But again, the combination of academics and really the scheme. Stanford's still known as a program that wants to build inside out. I think those things sold him on being a member of that Cardinal class and really the headliner, Bailey, in this Cardinal class. But you've got some spot recruiting wins elsewhere as well. You still built inside out, heavy trench class on offense and defense. And then you went outside of the region and did well in the South in particular. I'm really curious to see how Ashton Cozart develops, the quarterback they got out of Buford High School, which is a perennial power. That's something we've seen them do in recruiting quarterbacks. It's not always about the biggest, flashiest kid, but one who comes from a very winning program has translated well for Stanford. So they still hit some of their similar marks in what they build in a recruiting class. And again, from the prospect perspective, there's still a huge belief in what Stanford can offer on the field in terms of correcting itself under David Shaw, but then also off the field. It just kind of is what it is with the Cardinal. With Arizona, it's the opposite. It is, hey, this is a new coaching staff. The plan is to be exciting offensively under Jedd Fisch, and you could see a little bit of that in 2021, not in the win-loss column, but it's certainly in select moments of 2021. And then, again, you throw in the other school in the state being a disaster right now in Arizona State and all of the fluctuation in the Pac-12, and they kind of limped into some great recruiting wins. I don't want to discredit them, but they, that coaching staff was fortunate with some of these decisions, particularly with the Oregon coaching staff changing. The headlining recruit there for the Wildcats is Tyrell McMillan, a kid out of Servite High School, former Duck commitment, and one of the best receivers in the country, another member of the SI 99 rankings. But again, I say that they limped into it, not to bash them, but hey, luck is better than being good sometimes, right? So he happens to play at Servite High School with a quarterback, Noah Fafita, who was long committed to Arizona already. So there was already an internal, hey, come play with me at Arizona as well from his quarterback. So now that duo combined with tight end Keon Burnett, another Servite prospect, kind of headlined that group. And it's a very offensive heavy group that is playing into what we saw in glimpses in 2021. And hey, this is the first year transition program. We can do things offensively. Now we just need the guys. And I think that's an easy sell for Jedd Fisch and company. And you look around that commitment list and there's a lot of speed and playmaking ability. I mean, even on a national scale with those SI 99 recruits in McMillan and Burnett, but also the running back, Rayshawn Luke, kind of broke out as a senior, another California kid, and then went nuts at the All-American Bowl in Texas as one of the big play running backs that we've seen over the last year or two. And he's one of the fastest players in the country. So I do think Arizona had a unique advantage in all the transition going on in their state and in their conference, combined with, grabbing that quarterback early that happened to have some really key teammates. I think that really spearheaded their top 25 class. And it's one of the more remarkable things we've seen in recruiting relative to the on-field performance, as you said.
Yeah, I mean, you go 1-11. Your only win is a 10-3 absolute barn burner against Cal, who was under 500 a season ago as well. And then you look up and they're out recruiting schools who had much more successful seasons last year. And that's just not something that you expect to see. And I think part of the recruiting appeal with Jedd Fisch is his NFL background, right? He's worked under Bill Belichick. He worked under Sean McVay a little bit. And I think there are always valid questions raised when a coach comes from the NFL ranks, whether it's a head coach or a position coach or coordinators. Well, how's he going to recruit? Because you don't have to recruit. You do some scouting and player profiles in the NFL, but you don't have to actually go to living rooms, be out on the recruiting trail, and know how to talk to these kids to be able to pitch your program to them. That's a completely different thing. But part of the appeal that you do have as an NFL coach, even if you're kind of missing, that it factor of how to connect with young high school kids, is I've been in the NFL. I know what it takes to get there. Here's how we can get you to that sort of level. And by the way, everybody, this is just something that very rarely happens. I'm going to briefly correct John here. He had a little bit of a slip. I believe you said Ashton Cozart, the Oregon wide receiver, and it's Ashton Daniels, the Stanford quarterback commit in the class of 2022.
Yes, for sure. It is Daniels, Buford High School.
Yep. That's correct. We were talking about Cozart a little bit earlier in the day on when we were recording for Locked On Ducks and whatnot. So understandable, happens to the best. So goes to show you, even though John's the best at what he does, everybody makes mistakes from time to time. It does tend to happen. There's another surprise when it comes to Pac-12 recruiting rankings that we'll talk about after I remind you that I'm a huge fan of brownies. And you know what I love even more than the brownies is the brownie batter, because I don't know about you, John, but I prefer to just lick the spatula as you go along, and then you look down, you're like, boy, we're only filling like half the brownie pan here. Well, imagine if you could lick that brownie spatula, lick it completely clean, and get some protein. That's what you're getting in Built Bar's brownie batter puffs. That is a brownie batter flavored protein infused marshmallow. 140 calories, 17 grams of protein, only 7 grams of sugar. They're the perfect pick-me-up for literally any day. Go to Built.com, use promo code LOCK15. Get 15% off your order. Promo code LOCK15 for 15% off at Built.com. Another surprise in the Pac-12 when you're looking at the recruiting battles this year is Colorado is sitting there at 5th. Now, they weren't, as bad as Arizona last year, right? They went 4-8. And they've got Carl Durrell in. This is going to be his 3rd season. Last year was his 2nd. They had a promising shortened 2020 campaign. They were 4-2, and things were looking up. And then they kind of took a step back. I don't think they have quite the offensive firepower, but they have lost a lot of players in the transfer portal this year. Rice, the wide receiver, went down to USC along with every other wide receiver of note in the country. It seems. I mean, you got Jordan Addison there. You've got Terrell Bynum. You've got
Mario Williams.
Mario Williams from Oklahoma. Of course, everybody's going down there if you're a wideout and such. But kind of in that same realm that we were talking about, Arizona and Stanford being ahead of other programs. Oregon State has a 7-win season after being way down in previous years. They look to be trending up. UCLA has been down. When Chip Kelly first got there, they didn't even have a full assortment of scholarship players on the roster, I don't think. They have an 8-win season, and yet Colorado has a higher ranked recruiting class of those two schools when you're just looking at the high school kids. So what do you make of the Buffaloes kind of quietly bringing in a nice class for a program that is historically pretty tough to recruit at?
Yeah, I think the bounce back of, the pandemic restrictions that really hindered recruiting for a lot of programs that are like Colorado, that you have to rely on visits at schools like that. So those being lifted and the full allotment of official visits and all of that coming back to college football, I think really benefited a program like Colorado. Obviously, it's a unique campus, a unique atmosphere relative to some others, not only in the Pac-12, but nationally. So they were able to go in early with top prospects in terms of getting them on campus. So I think they started out pretty strong. I think at one point they had maybe the biggest class in the country like a year ago at this point. So I think that strength out of the gate was really important for that staff. And then they identified some talent outside the region that really works. I really love their last pickup in the class. Anthony Hankerson, a kid from down in my neck of the woods in Fort Lauderdale, St. Thomas Aquinas. This is a old school. Like, you think of Colorado in the 90s, you think of these running backs, right? This kid fits some of that. I mean, he is a physical downhill runner who I would just be shocked if he doesn't play relatively early when he gets up to Colorado. And I think staying on a kid like that, where at one point it looked like he was going to go to bigger options, he had a lot of options earlier in his recruitment. Sticking with a kid like that, I think, combined with a visit, again, something unique, something different outside the box, starts to help bridge the gap for schools like Colorado. So you grab him, and now there's other kids from South Florida. I think another one of his teammates at St. Thomas is headed up to Colorado as well. So you start galvanizing outside of the region a little bit. And then you got some names, right? Not just Hankerson. I mean, Owen McCown, obviously. All the McCowns play quarterback in the NFL. So you grab one from Texas, and a necessary footprint for Colorado. You got to recruit Cali. You got to recruit Texas if you're Colorado. So getting a class headliner and a quarterback early like Owen McCown, I thought was really important in terms of bringing in other skill talent like Hankerson, who we just talked about. So that was good outside of the region as well. And again, another early positive evaluation for the Buffaloes. And then you still have to counter that with local talent. I think Travis Gray, the legacy recruit, those are important ones to win as well, because not only do you get a 6'5" athletic offensive lineman who could eventually, play into the starting lineup, but now you're getting a guy who knows Colorado, who's close to home, in state, who's going to recruit publicly for the Buffs. And I think schools that are not obvious in recruiting, you always need that peer-to-peer recruiting. That's one of the lessons from those pandemic level restrictions, that when you couldn't visit, you needed the peers, the fellow recruits to really jump in for you. And I think Gray was a big part of that, along with McCown, in building this Buff class just as much as the coaching staff was. So it's kind of the right formula for Colorado in terms of going outside of the region, identifying kids early, landing them early, and then keeping some local talent home as well. So kind of the perfect storm for Colorado. But again, now you have to complement that with some more on-field success, I would say, to try to duplicate that here in the 23 cycle.
Yeah, I think that there's more pressure on a school like Colorado to win on the field to keep that sort of recruiting momentum going, or else it just is going to, I think, give off the vibe of a program of like, oh, well, they're just going to be down and they're not going to, do this, that, or the other thing. And it's not as if Colorado isn't capable of being a solid program. It's a lot tougher than at other schools, right? If you're a new or a young head coach, it's tougher to win at Colorado than at, say, USC or Oregon or heck, even Washington, right? If I'm trying to rebuild, if I'm picking a school to rebuild at and I'm a young up and coming head coach, which, sounds kind of fun, but also sounds like a lot of work, frankly. I would rather be at a place like Washington than Colorado, just because you've got more kids in state. You've got, probably more money at the program as well, and just a better tradition there. But it's been done before. Colorado has won the Pac-12 South. That was back in 2016, I believe. They got to the championship game, had a 10-win season. So it's been done. It's just a little bit tougher than at some other places. I think Cal Berkeley kind of falls into that category as well. Two teams that were at or near the top of the conference recruiting rankings this year, unsurprisingly, the two that met in the Pac-12 championship game this past season, Oregon and Utah. And there's a litany of potentially high-impact recruits who could play pretty early in their careers for the Ducks and the Utes this season. Let's just go one of each, John. So of all the guys that are incoming true freshmen for Oregon, the class of 2022. We'll start with them, and then we'll go to Utah. Which freshman do you think could make the biggest impact this year?
It's a great question. I thought, certainly you could go offensive skill, maybe in the secondary for the Ducks, but I'm going to the top of the rankings, man. SI 99 recruit Joshua Connerly. I know he's the latest arriving true freshman, but I'm not saying game one. Once you get to game 8, 9, 10, a little bit of attrition on the offensive line that comes naturally in the Power 5, you're not going to keep that kid off the field. We've seen them play true freshmen and trust true freshmen along the offensive line. Penei Sewell obviously comes to mind, and Connerly, talent-wise, could be in that realm. Now, Sewell was bigger and more physically developed when he got to Oregon, but Connerly's played all these other sports. So now he's going to focus on football. So again, through the summer into the fall, just so curious to see how he develops physically as he assimilates in towards the college level. But look, I think there's a lot of ground and pound and physicality that's desired in Oregon from the last regime and this regime, but you still need finesse. You still need a pass block. It's still a pass-first sport in nature, and that's where Josh Connerly is among the best in the country at any school, even as potentially as a true freshman. So I'm still really excited to see where he looks later in the season. So maybe not instant impact day one, but season one, I think that box will be checked.
What about for Utah? What sort of incoming freshman? Let's go past the transfers. Like you figure Mohamed Diabate, the Florida linebacker, probably going to slide in and take Devin Lloyd's starting slot, or at least he has the potential to do that. But which up and comers for the Utes do you really like?
I like Jalen Glover, the running back. Running back's one of those positions, Spencer, where we see the ability to make an instant impact. I think running back, receiver, pass rusher are usually the spots where even in spot duty, you see true freshmen doing considerable damage at the next level. And I think Glover, who's already up there, he's already kind of bought into everything Utah. I think he's got like a documentary or something coming out on him about his tribulations up there. This is a physically ready back for college football, low center of gravity kid, extremely agile, good laterally, can play out of the backfield as well. You think of Utah, you think of defense first, but then offensively you think of that Zach Moss attitude, a style from the running back position. And we know we know offensively, look, Cam Rising's back, top 10 quarterback, all that stuff, but you still need to counter that. And I think, Jalen Glover could work into that running back rotation sooner rather than later. And he might be a specialist or a short yardage guy early on. But again, extremely productive at one of the top high schools in Florida, and a kid that we were shocked down in the South to see get out of the region because we thought for sure this was going to be a Florida Gator or somebody like that at the end of the day. So I've always been a fan of Jalen Glover, under-recruited kid relative to his production. And those are the kind of kids that Utah evaluates and identifies and gets committed that makes you say, man, like, what in the world? This kid's from down here? How did that happen? I think he's just the next chip on your shoulder kind of back that's going to do really well at Utah. So my eyes are on Jalen Glover for sure.
Under-recruited, chip on your shoulder. That's a Utah football special right there. I think that's Kyle Whittingham's MO, just kind of generally speaking. And yes, they have a first-team All Pac-12 running back returning in Tavion Thomas, but you still have to have a complementary back or two, or sometimes even three, because guys can get injured, right? I mean, teams have been undergoing that occurrence for quite some time. Like you want to have one lead back who can carry the workload, especially in a physical team like Utah who wants to run the football, but you've got to be able to spell them. And I think Glover could be a candidate for that as well. Let's move on to Washington. The Huskies are down. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. The Huskies are down relative to where that program expects to be. New head coach coming in Kalen DeBoer. But before we get to what he needs to do to turn things around, specifically on the recruiting trail, given that is your area of expertise, as you've watched the program and such over the years, how do you think Washington has fallen so far down, relative to where they were really not that long ago? I mean, it was 2017 when they were the college football playoff. You go from that, right, almost at the top of the sport 5 years ago to now bottom third in the recruiting and transfer portal rankings in the Pac-12 conference, not just nationally, but in the Pac-12 conference, 4-8 in 2021. Like, what do you think happened here?
Transition, it's just hard. One time it's hard, right? I think everybody could agree. Transitioning at the top is very hard, but you do it twice in 3 years, and you're multiplying the difficulty in terms of trying to establish who in the world you are as a recruiting program. And I think Washington has had its moments on the recruiting trail. They're still known more for identification and development than just winning top tier battles. But I do think there was still an identity there, and I'm not sure what exists now in terms of Washington recruiting. I think it's mostly regional now, into the Pacific Northwest, and what is the niche with Husky recruiting? I think it's still to be determined, and that's not good for a Power 5 program. You need to have kind of that core foundation of, hey, when I get this offer as a recruit, I know I'm going to get this if I look further into that. And I think that's up in the air to a degree with Washington at the moment. And the coaching transition certainly plays a role into that. And I do think on the flip side, you want to recruit regionally, and that's your base, and Seattle's a great metro to pull from right at home. But on the flip side, since 2017, how many of those high-profile battles have they actually won with the select big-name recruits in the area? So the guys who move the needle, the guys who other recruits who are maybe younger look up to, like a JT Tuimoloau, you look at those battles and say, okay, well, he went to Ohio State. Okay, what about, Jaden Wayne in this class? Well, probably not going to go to Washington. Okay, well, what's going on with Washington, right? That's kind of the natural question to go back to. I don't know the last big high-profile, local kid they got. I mean, Savell Smalls, maybe, and that's a problem. So you're having to relegate yourself regionally to recruit, and you're unable to win the big regional battles that have become national. On top of that, combined with changing coaches twice in 3 years, there's just a lack of identity with what that offer could mean, right? Me and you, again, from 30,000 feet, say, okay, DBs are going to be great at Washington. Defensively, you kind of start there. And then you look at other spot, positions and say, hey, they've got a chance. They've had production at running back and wide receiver, et cetera, over the years relative to the NFL draft. Today's recruit doesn't really see that outside of the secondary. And again, it's more of a developmental deal than identifying a kid that everybody wants and winning that battle and still having the chance to develop him. So I just think it's kind of the chips are down all together across the board with Washington right now. And they need that galvanizing recruit to turn things around. And again, with Jaden Wayne, there's one right in their backyard. If you could stay in that race and maybe win it, now all of a sudden, other kids will see that. But it's hard to imagine that happening as we currently sit.
Yeah, I think the only, significantly major recruit that they've been able to land in the last several years who's from their own state is probably Sam Heward, who Washington fans are still waiting to arrive because there's a good chance he won't even be the starting quarterback for the Huskies this year. And so I think you just have to find a way, like you said, to just get one. And sometimes that can get the ball rolling, and people will start to, recruits will start to view your program differently if you see like, oh, that big name guy decided to go there. And so now maybe I want to take a second look at it. Or maybe I want to take a look when I wasn't considering it before. So now that Kalen DeBoer is there and starting to, he's got his staff and they're hitting the recruiting trail and whatnot, trying to get the program back to where we all know it can be. How do you think he needs to do that? What's the recruiting message, and what should the plan of attack be like for DeBoer and his staff?
I think for him, it's going to be educational more than anything. It's going to be like, hey, like if you actually take a closer look, Washington has been a great program for a long time. And with what matters most for these prospects, whether it's the NFL or NIL in some cases, you can sell that if you work it the right way, right? They've had success in developing players and towards, playing on Sundays, and they're one of these schools that's in a huge metro. So you're able to potentially say, hey, you can actually have more opportunity at a place like Seattle relative to some others in the Pac-12 or elsewhere. So I think educationally, they have to establish their footprint. And then on the field, the promise of however, Kalen got the job, which is obviously selling offense with what he did at Fresno State, that's got to start to translate. You brought in a transfer quarterback in Michael Penix. As you mentioned, Sam Heward is certainly there with the most talent in that quarterback room. It's got to translate early. So if you're a Washington fan, first of all, don't hate me. I apologize. But secondly, just hang tight. Let the season begin and go from there, because it's just not one of those programs that is getting that benefit of the doubt we talked about with a David Shaw, with a Stanford, or even other programs that have transitioned with more well-known recruiters like Oregon and Dan Lanning, or certainly USC with Lincoln Riley, that have jumped into the Pac-12. I think those things absolutely affect and hurt Washington on the front end of building a recruiting class. But a handful of commits are in. They just got one over the weekend on the defensive side of the ball, so maybe this is the beginning of a turnaround. But get through the summer. You'll host June official visitors. You'll have a couple more commitments, and then it's got to translate on the field. So sell the development and the history, and then counter it with some on-field perceptional success.
Husky fans are hoping that things will start to feel a little bit better and more encouraging on the recruiting trail. And whether they do or not, we'll continue to bring on John Garcia Jr., Director of Recruiting for Sports Illustrated. Great to have you on the show, as always, John.
Always a pleasure, Spencer. Thanks for having me.
I appreciate all of you for listening. I will see you next time, and have a wonderful rest of your day.